continue with the next speaker, and he will speak on the Kodak. Ian Casey will speak on the Kodak syndrome, risks and opportunities created by decentralization of forensic capabilities. Ian Casey is professor of digital forensic and investigation at the University of Lausanne, School of Criminal Justice, where he teaches, conducts research and performs casework. He's also partner of digital forensic solutions, where he performs research and development related to digital forensics and cybersecurity. For nearly 2 decades, he has dedicated himself to advancing the practices of digital forensic science and data breach investigation. In his former role of chief scientist of the Defense Cyber Crime Center, DC3, which houses one of the largest accredited digital forensic laboratories in the world, Ian Casey prioritized research and development across multiple organizational units and provided strategic and technical guidance to navigate evolving challenges in digital forensic science and data breach investigation. Owen Casey has consulted with many attorneys, agencies, and police departments in the United States, South America, and Europe on a wide range of digital investigations, including fraud, violent crime, identity theft, and online criminal activities. So he has written many books and book chapters. He's also editor-in-chief of the journal Digital Investigation, the International Journal of Digital Forensics and Incident Response. And he's also working on the IFS 2020 workshop in collaboration with the Digital Forensic Science Researcher Workshop in Sydney. So, it's your working on. Okay.
So I'll remember to write a shorter bio next time. Sorry. And this is an honor. Thank you for the opportunity to come address the AAFS. And I want to start by saying I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants here. This is a work in progress that we've been building over the past number of years, but Pierre Margot, Claude Roux, and Olivier Ribaud have really worked with me on this. We've all worked together. This is a collective effort, and it's growing. It's actually coincidental that my presentation follows such a good demonstration of the powers, the potentials of decentralization of forensic capabilities, but I want to bring this into kind of another scale that we're starting to see. But at the same time, I'd like to give you, this is more kind of a homecoming for me. I've been traveling the world. It's kind of like Gulliver's Travels, where I've come through private sector, running as a director of a digital forensic laboratory, and then into the government under the Air Force in the DoD's DC3 computer forensic laboratory, and then into academia, where in the University of Lausanne, it's a strong combination of the forensic disciplines, and we have a forensic laboratory where we do casework and research. But getting that perspective, the broad perspective across private sector, academia, government, the US, Europe, and also Australia, has given me a bit of a revelation in recent years. I'll be moving back to the US in this year with my family for family reasons, but it's a sense of being part of a growing movement, and I'd like to say that I hope that you'll move with me on this. It's a little bit of a fast pace. We're under a growing pressure. I'm going to talk about this from an interdisciplinary standpoint, but I'll give you also my perspective from digital multimedia. And as a member of the DMSAC, the OSAC, and interacting with a lot of the people around the world who participate in that, it's given me an appreciation for the challenges and the effort that we all put in. So I'd like to say again, this is a collective effort, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. With the growing demands of investigative demands on us to provide forensic results, There's also an expectation of reduced time and cost, which is making our pressures increase. And we're seeing forensic science expanding from just let's say, the more complex cases to secondary uses, to investigations of activities that don't necessarily fall into the criminal investigation realm, but start to be useful for other purposes. And that broad use of forensic science, again, puts increased pressure on us to produce results of high scientific rigor, quickly, cheaply. That also is a challenge when we see the seriality of crime, especially in the cyber realm, increasing, with the ransomware attacks, cyber attacks increasing in scale. And this is an area that I've been working in for many years, and it's difficult to keep pace. So with all these pressures comes, I think, an increasing realization that forensic science no longer, or if it ever was, really focused just in providing testimony in court. It has a broader use, and this is something that Pierre Margot has emphasized in the past, that we have a role of problem solvers or privileged observers. And the beginning of an investigation or any evidential inquiry has, at the beginning, a large potential to apply forensic capabilities. We may even not get some of the evidence that exists at that point, but the opportunity is large. And so as we move along in our inquiry, and you see in the picture here from the policing relevance, we start to filter down the information. There's less relevance in subsequent stages, but it becomes more relevant from the judicial standpoint. And when we get to trial, that's where the core principles of forensic science have really been emphasized. But one of the challenges here is now we're pushing a lot of those capabilities to the field. And with that comes a risk of losing some of the scientific rigor. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. And it could be a broader discussion that could go on for a lot longer in the context of some of the discussions that with the next generation identification and some of the systems that are being deployed. But this is going to continue in, I'd say, into the near future and into the far future in a number of disciplines that you might not currently expect. And some new areas where digital forensics really starts to come into the fore. In the past, with DNA and fingerprints, we had quite a long, I'd say, lead time to develop or to study the information that we could extract and to make use of it. And it was relatively comfortable, but with perhaps a little bit more complexity with the scientific elements and the technology changing a little more rapidly. But as time develops, we have mobile devices, we have smartphones coming out, and we're starting to get a lot more information and have a lot more cases that have this information, and how do we deal with this? Now we're heading into a new realm with IoT, multimedia being produced on massive scales, and digital evidence becoming more relevant in a wider variety of investigations. We're starting to see the ability to study this evidence, these sources of information, shrink in time. I have master's students who have 6 months on a final master's project who are doing work that advances our field in understanding some of these devices and making an impact in a short time that then becomes not quite obsolete, but outdated very quickly as the technology advances. And now we're talking about the cloud. I can't tell you how much information we are not getting from the cloud. That's relevant to fire investigation, burglaries, just traditional investigations. And this is something where we're studying some of the traces left, for example, by Google Home, smart buildings, and you're getting telemetry from spaces that can show movement of an individual, movement of temperature in different locations every 15 minutes. You're getting information if you pull it, but how do we get that? How do we get it quickly? How do we analyze it? This volume, variety, the velocity of the data is immense, and the value is potentially high if we can harness it, and the validity is potentially high if we can bring the science to it, but the complexity is also high. And so there are some challenges that we'll face through this big data problem, but also the seriality, where investigations and prosecutions of a single case have started to become, I'd say, commonplace, but as we get the more ability to link to other crimes and see high volume crime, organized crime increasing, where identity theft and digital identity theft and organized crime. We're starting to then see the cyber realm explode with seriality. So all of these, we have a need for this type of, I would call it forensic intelligence or intelligence-led analysis, where we can make use of data and automation quickly, but we need not forget the principles of forensic science in the process. So I've been banging my head against this change for longer than I care to say. I suppose I'd say that changing the forensic laboratory that has a traditional approach, and this applies to many disciplines, but digital included, you might be surprised that as new as digital evidence is, there is a resistance to change. And so some of the answers in discussing over the past couple of years of the need for this dealing with these problems and changing the way that we approach problem solving in a forensic laboratory are met with a lot of resistance. And one of the answers that I get is, well, if it's outside the laboratory, is it really forensic science? And that's really creating a border that I think is unhealthy. There's really no place for divorcing the investigation from the scientific laboratory. These I think have to work together, and there's a need for the forensic capabilities in the field. There's a legitimate need for that. The requirement of accreditation is also one of the elements that's being pushed. So state and local law enforcement, or if they have digital forensic capabilities, do they have to get accredited? This is one of the discussions and debates that has come up, and really it becomes a barrier to entry for the use of forensic capabilities if a state or local unit has to go through an accreditation process to perform that work to testify in court. And then another, this is coming from the UK more than anywhere else that I've seen. Perhaps it's a British reaction. I'm Irish, so maybe there's a little bias there. But in fact, I'm going to pick on the Irish in a minute as well. The rationing of forensic science services. We can't keep up with the pace that I just described. So tell people to go away. If you have evidence that's not as important as the other person, we're not going to touch it. That's not a way to deal with this problem. This is certainly there's a need for prioritization and budgeting, but to systematically create a solution that denies the problem, I think, is the wrong approach. It's denying justice. So let's look at this in just a simple case example, carrying on from for example, face or the image comparison area, that we're now seeing a dispute arise, this struggle between the science and the operational aspects of the use of forensic capabilities. The UK forensic regulator, at the beginning of 2019, put out guidelines for requirements for expert opinion to be rendered for a comparison in image evidence. So if you have a face or a vehicle, for example, to present that in court, that this vehicle has features compatible with the suspect vehicle, or this person, this person's face is close similarity with the face of the image, requires content specialization, expertise in the content of the image. Where then the reaction to, and this was from Canada, from QC, in this case it was a JW hack, argued that you don't need that specialized knowledge of content. You just need to be familiar with video and image analysis. From an operational standpoint, looking at CCTV and the ability to process this, enhance it, and then look at the face, look at the candidate, and make a decision, make an opinion. The fine point of, I think, disagreement. So Jill Tully and one of her colleagues, she's the UK forensic science regulator, who's dealing with a lot of these issues in the UK, but it has international impact. She pointed out that there's a fundamental difference in the approach of looking at something and making an opinion if you're not using a scientific framework, versus using a scientific framework. And this is something that we've, I think, acknowledged and recognized in a lot of the work of the OSAC, but we've also realized the challenge of educating the vast majority of practitioners who are out in the field looking at mobile devices, CCTV, sources of digital traces or multimedia traces, who don't have a scientific background, who don't necessarily have the training necessary to produce an expert opinion in an evaluative framework. And the question then becomes, how do we address this fine point? Do we make everyone scientists before they can use some of the technology? Do we put management around the use of the technology that governs how they can use the information? And these are all questions that I'd like to touch on. And it is kind of inspiring to see some of these issues already being addressed by the FBI in certain disciplines. But this is a trend that is increasing, and it's increasing quickly, especially in the digital realm. So forensic science laboratories are struggling to keep pace. So what are we doing? We're optimizing the cost, speed, quality equation. We're becoming essentially transactional, trying to get things out as quickly as possible if we're given information because of the demand for quick results, but it's not fast enough. We can't keep pace. So the reaction in a lot of areas is non-specialists are taking forensic capabilities in the field. Sometimes it's commercial, sometimes it's provided by the government, but it's being used but in many situations, with notable exceptions of some of the systems that Dr. Callahan presented, in isolation. So not in connection with the primary use of a centralized database, but in isolation and examining and analyzing a mobile device, or pulling information from technology, sources of data, or CCTV, and using that evidence in the individual case without any sort of systematic or organized forensic or scientific framework. And in the field personnel are then deciding what to submit to the laboratories, or not. As we see in digital, more and more people are trying to take the information themselves without perhaps sufficient scientific knowledge, but testify in their case of what that information means. And that puts the forensic laboratory in a difficult position. As you have the increasing and faster decentralization of these capabilities, the forensic laboratory loses touch with those items of evidence. We lose touch with the fundamental object that we study because we're not having it submitted. Phones, computers, CCTV being handled in the field creates a gap. And it's a knowledge gap that we ultimately, I think, are going to pay for if we don't get ahead of it. And this can also, I'd say, apply to soon ballistics. We're starting to hear some of the automated processing, also drug analysis. I'll give an example of this. So areas that weren't mentioned in the previous presentation, but still are developing and pushing the capabilities out to the field. So another approach to this challenge is to embrace the change. And I put a question mark beside this because this is a new effort in Australia to manage the transitioning of technology from the laboratory to the field. One of the areas that, this is where Dr. Rue was active in trying to advise and direct some of this strategy. But there's valid need to have rapid and analytical results in the field. Investigators benefit from these investigative leads, perhaps intelligence leads, and you have also potentially the ability to analyze something before it has the risk of being corrupted, damaged in transport. Also, you have potential for some more sophisticated technologies to be applied at that moment with machine learning and artificial intelligence, some clustering, some analysis that can be providing investigatively useful information quickly. The problem is in these strategies is it doesn't necessarily take into account the need to manage this more from a, let's say, a forensic science perspective. And some of the systems that were described by Dr. Callahan have taken this into consideration, but this isn't the case with all types of evidence that are being handled, most notably digital. So we don't yet know how the Australian strategy will work, but it's also coming after the horses have left the barn in a way. So it's trying to get our hands around a problem that's already well on its way to kind of beyond potentially our grasp to manage. Now, I've worked in a managerial role in laboratories, but also in an administrative role, but also in a casework role. So I see both sides, and I just want to say that I'm looking also at the bottom line here. And from a forensic science perspective, from a laboratory perspective, the bottom line is we're losing budget. We're losing, there's less money being directed towards the forensic science research and development and practice in a laboratory context, and more of that money is being pushed into operational capabilities. And if I have time towards the end of the talk, I might mention a project that we've started in a law enforcement context for forensic intelligence, dealing with investigation of crime across European borders and sharing information. But the funding was to law enforcement to develop these capabilities. And until I was involved, there was no forensic science involved. We've also proposed projects from the Forensic Institute side with the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes. Less funding goes to those. We haven't been successful to get some, I'd say, more fundamentally scientific projects funded. Only the really operational, immediate result projects for law enforcement purposes are getting that funding. So what that is doing is it's driving the decentralization movement. It's also driving our focus on efficiency and cost reduction. So what we end up with is forensic scientists traditionally being in a forensic laboratory context, for instance, receiving evidence, studying this, developing a familiarity, being able to see and develop an expertise over time to see patterns in what our expertise is. In my case, it's digital. In others, it might be ballistics or drugs. You see, even over short periods of time, experts in labs having a sense of a trend developing in their area. But if you start to have decentralization without some of this centralized knowledge management, you lose that visibility. You lose that ability to study the sources of evidence in a forensic science context. And it's also because of the transactional nature and the pressures on the laboratories to be more efficient and cost effective, it's pushing a lot of experienced forensic scientists to work harder, faster, they have less time to mentor the next generation, and potentially are leaving, going to academia, or and academia is a safe haven because we can do some of the research and we can teach the next generation, taking advantage of the expertise that we've gained without the pressure, as much of the pressures of the forensic laboratory environment, but it does take, again, away from the lab. And ultimately, the research, I think, is going to reduce our ability to create new capabilities for forensic analysis and correlation of data in ways that we need to be doing as this scale, the big data problem, is increasing, but as the need for that information increases. And if we don't have the tools to deliver value to the field, the laboratory becomes obsolete. And this is where Kodak syndrome comes in. So we'd like to just reflect back on the Polaroid, the days, my kids still love this. It's kind of like a hark back. They still take the Polaroids, but it's at weddings. It's like a novelty. But the traditional film industry really shifted over a period of my generation. We saw Kodak lose its business, essentially. It went and filed bankruptcy a couple of times, but it did not keep pace with the ability of individuals to generate their own digital images and use this in social media. They just were stuck in much more of the laboratory and material culture. That was their business, and they didn't adapt. And ultimately, their value to customers was essentially nil at this point. And if we draw an analogy between the forensic science providers and forensic laboratories that aren't adapting to the shift of decentralization, we're looking at the, let's say this is creating it's creating a Kodak-like phenomenon where if we're not going to the next generation of systems, of dealing with these sources of evidence in a way that is keeping pace with the need and the scale of change, we're going to be obsolete. And so this analogy it's a question. It's as with every analogy, it has its limitations. But the question is, can we or do we have the ability across all of the needs of operational investigations, people in the field, do we have the ability to make a digital transformation in forensic science? And I don't just mean this from a technological standpoint. I mean, can we bring science to the field? And this is where I have come in my Gulliver's travels of going between US, Europe, Australia, going across the sectors. I've changed my view from looking at changing the laboratory to looking at being a forensic advisor to the field. So we can no longer wait for the evidence to be submitted to us as forensic scientists. If we wait, the doors will close eventually. The forensic scientists have to go to the evidence. And this is where I'm going and where we're teaching a new generation to be forensic advisors, essentially providing expertise in forensic science to the field, being engaged. And so this is to avoid an obsolescence in the laboratory, but also blunders in the field. Because if you have this interaction between the forensic science and the operational needs, and you have a strong marriage between the two, the lab needs the data. We need the information that's being collected in these investigations to study our objects, our evidence of specialization, to gain more knowledge of these sources of evidence, but also broader trends across regions, with crime patterns. But the field also needs our knowledge and the tools and methods that we can provide, and some of the approaches that bring a strong scientific rigor to the result. And I would say to view it as simply a technological problem is going to be a recipe for disaster. We have to bring people from the field into the lab and vice versa. It has to be a symbiotic exchange. And I thought of this, this is happening, I thought of this in the previous presentation. This slide looks pretty outdated now that we see the FBI's capabilities, but this is already happening. The use of forensic capabilities for operational needs. The challenge becomes as we get into IoT, the cloud. If you look at crime scene investigation, we're now thinking of this as investigation. It's no longer crime scene investigation. It's investigation of broader realm of just the physical space, but looking out at what other information exists that could be useful to investigate the fire, investigate the burglary. There might be information on the cloud that we have to obtain and interpret. So with this comes some questions. That we have to question the traditional boundaries that perhaps we've taken for granted in forensic science for our careers, and look at scientific reliability versus contextual information. If we just take the trace out of context in the laboratory, we lose that context, and that context can have value for the investigation. So how do we marry the two? Isolating the evidence out in the field for an individual case loses the opportunity to generate a combined visibility across, say, drug problem a developing drug problem in a particular region as new narcotics enter a region. With the robustness and timeliness balance, we have to think about how do we make a compromise at the beginning, perhaps to give timely results, but make sure that the scientific robustness comes quickly or the information isn't misused to make incorrect decisions. So all of this is a knowledge management problem. And with technology, it can help, and we've been in Lausanne developing, for example, with drug analysis, the ability for police on the street to do check of narcotics. There are certain levels of, for example, of THC that are permitted legally and certain levels that are illegal. So being able to check that on the street is valuable. But if you have each of those individual checks happening in isolation without any gathering of the data centrally and analysis, you lose visibility across the problem, but also you lose the ability to analyze that data with more advanced analysis techniques, so machine learning, for instance. So what we've been developing is a capability to bring a near-infrared technology out to the field in the hands of police, but gathering the data centrally and learning through study and then programming the system, feeding back into the system that then is supporting the police in the field, the clustering of different narcotics. So that makes a powerful combination of these secondary uses combined with the primary use in the lab of being able to see quickly in the field what your information is and make a decision. Is this person carrying something illegal or not? But then also bring the information back to the lab to have the information to study the trace more deeply, and having the opportunity potentially to get the samples to support deeper analysis. If it's a new narcotic, if there's something that's not showing up then in the near-infrared technology, it's not recognizing it, or it has some variation that we're seeing outside of a cluster, we can study that more deeply. We can target our analysis and be more efficient. So this is happening also in digital, where there's a knowledge management problem, and there were, I'll take two examples, one from the US, one from the Netherlands, where there were, with the San Bernardino case, there were capabilities within the FBI to handle the iPhone that was ultimately in question, that knowledge didn't make it to the field fast enough. And this is a report that was an internal inquiry that determined this, but ultimately it shows the need, even within a single organization, to connect the laboratory capabilities in the field. With the NFI, there was a case where they had BlackBerries that were encrypted. The police or the investigators had a huge amount of data that they couldn't access. With a combination of the expertise at the NFI, they were able to decrypt huge amounts of these communications in an organized criminal investigation to basically crack open the case for the investigators. And this is where you start to see the power of combining these capabilities, where you have decentralized collection of information. The police are collecting mobile devices out in the field, but also supported by some of the powerful forensic science capabilities that can then unlock the data and then also help provide a scientific interpretation of that information. This is a diagram that I don't expect you to be able to read every detail, but there is, the crossing borders is really complex. So we're crossing not just the borders of the field and the lab, but also collaboration with industry when we're looking at technologies, and also if we're looking at cybercrime. There's a lot of information on networks of corporate organizations that can be useful, and they have knowledge that can be useful to us as well. There's also intelligence in the picture here. So having systematic knowledge management across the law enforcement, forensic science laboratory, industry, and intelligence is necessary. It's happening in certain sectors. But to enable this, to facilitate this, we need forensic advisors, or some people call them forensic consultants, and they're placed in between these borders to do the translating, to help identify new sources of information at the crime scene or in an investigation in the field, and determine when there's capabilities back in the laboratory that can support deeper analysis that could really help the investigation. Otherwise, people in the field might overlook a Nest device or some information that's visible at the crime scene, not realizing that there's a huge amount of information in the cloud that could support their investigation. Not knowing that there's a way to go get this and analyze it quickly and provide potentially an understanding of how a fire progressed, how a burglary occurred, how even a violent crime in a smart building progressed, do some reconstruction with the help of some of this digital information. So this is a point where this is bidirectional cross-border sharing between lab and the field, and also within the field itself. And this is a challenge that I think we're going to face, where you have knowledge in individual pockets in the field that we need to connect. And this is where, to a degree, technology can help, to a degree, meetings can help, but I'll say there's a need to involve more of the field in our work. We are somewhat now becoming isolated in many contexts, especially digital. In Ireland, I'll single them out. They were so the laboratory, Sheila Willis was in charge of it for a number of years, and there was a digital forensic capability, but the guards, the police, became impatient. They didn't need all of this science, this rigor. They just needed the data. And so they took it back. They no longer submit any of the computers or mobile devices to the forensic laboratory. They do it themselves. And with increasing budget and with increasing risk, I would say, of not having solid evidence to build their case on. This is happening in the UK as well, with a number of notable cases that have been made it to court and been criticized, causing a national crisis where the UK forensic regulator, the House of Lords, and the state's or the high-level attorney have all had to become involved to understand why are mistakes happening. It's because the decentralization of forensic capabilities is happening so quickly without the management from a forensic science perspective that we're making blunders, we're making mistakes. So with that, I'd like to give some hope that there are models, even within large-scale intrusion investigations across the nation. And this was in DC3. We have the capability to pull information from individual incidents with the help of industry, with the involvement of other government organizations, analyze the data from malware and intrusion evidence, produce some immediate results for the investigation, but then correlate this with prior information and other intelligence to gain a broader understanding of the developing problems and see trends. So this is data fusion, this also connecting to a degree with adversary profile development, gives a broader understanding of the problem. And then that enables strategic responses, not just individual investigative solutions. There are multiple models. No single model will fit all regions or all countries. So in talking and exploring with colleagues, we've seen the Australian Federal Police have a consulting model, which has been quite effective, where they go out into the field, they bring some of the forensic advisor and forensic consulting model to the field, and then come back and start to form a team for problem solving. With the French Gendarmerie, they're a scientific police, and so they bring the forensic science into the investigation systematically, and they teach their police, many of them, give them a strong forensic science background. The Netherlands Forensic Institute is also very strong in terms of digital forensics as a service, and also now other forensic services that are becoming supported by technology to interact with the field. I think drug analysis is one that's under development, and ballistics, as I've heard, is another. So really codifying the knowledge centrally that's being generated through the decentralization of forensic capabilities, and delivering back value to those decentralized units to enable them to make better decisions. And the FBI Regional Forensic Laboratory is another model. Thank you. So if we think ahead at how this is developing, we're starting to see an increase in it's the pace of change, and the increase in scale is making it more difficult for us to anticipate what information will be valuable in our investigations. I raised IoT in the homes as one example, data in the cloud as another, but these large-scale global impact crimes like ransomware and systematic compromise of corporations and individuals' identities is making it so we're very reactive. And we need to be better working together with people in the field, in industry, and our laboratories to keep pace with wearable technologies, with IoT becoming more prevalent. We have to find solutions more rapidly, and we have to do that together. So some takeaways: the rupture that's exposed by this catalyzation of decentralization and digital transformations is something that I think we now all see, and this was emphasized fortuitously by Dr. Callahan, that we're starting to see solutions, but also with that comes problems. We need forensic science in the laboratory to play a more problem-solving role and central role in managing the privacy issues, the scientific rigor that is really central to why we're here. But if the forensic capabilities are in the hands of people who don't have that training and background, we lose. And the enabling of timely informed decisions is critical, so we can't deny this, we can't put our heads in the sand, we have to embrace this and figure out a way to manage it. And then ultimately, the value of forensic knowledge is beyond just testimony. Its value in the field, its value from a forensic intelligence standpoint is extremely high. And the stakes are high. This is from a paper that we published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in late 2018. But the stakes are high because failing to undertake these transformations may mean isolating investigators or missing or misinterpreting traces, and the criminal justice organizations lacking a comprehensive vista of criminal activities, and policymakers losing opportunities to develop strategies for dealing with crime and security. So this is really a combination of crisis and opportunity. And I'd say by crossing borders, that's the only way that we have a chance to get ahead of this. And it will take people going, I'd say, from the scientific perspective out to the operational perspective and bringing our knowledge to the field. This is a crisitude, a Simpson moment, that we can embrace this and we can get ahead of it together. And I'd like to acknowledge the giants that I'm standing on their shoulders. Hopefully I've done them justice. That across the international landscape, these problems are not isolated, these are everywhere. And we don't just work together in the region that we have to look more broadly internationally to solve these problems. So thank you.